recording immediately, but let's check. Yes, it did. Oh, we got 2 people already. Welcome, everybody. We still have 2 minutes before we start. If you would like to type in the chat box where you're located, that would be very useful for the speaker to know where everybody is. We get people from around the US usually, and some from other countries. So if you'd like to type in the chat box, let us know where you are located. It would be appreciated. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. They're usually shy. They don't like to say where they are. Welcome, everybody. You should be seeing me talk and hopefully hearing me as well. If you're seeing my mouth moving, you can always type in the chat box if you can't hear me. The chat says, oh,
the host has disabled it, so hopefully you're the host.
Yeah, that's me. Okay, hopefully it is not disabled anymore. So if you'd like to type in the chat box, which is supposed to be functioning, then I would appreciate it. Oh, Pam's here again. Pam's one of our regulars. She's also on the committee. St. Helens, Oregon. Indiana, Kosovo. See, I told you get some from other places. South Carolina. Oh, it's 3 o'clock. So if you'd like to keep chatting, feel free. If you are one of the Kentucky agents who needs continuing education credits, I need you to type in the chat box that you're here at the beginning, and then again at the end. You have to be here for the full hour in order to get the continuing education credits. And I forgot I had to send some to Pam. I better remind myself to do.
Hi, Altane.
Oh, yes. She a friend? She's one of your students?
No, we met several years ago when she was visiting, so in the United States. So
okay. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock, so we'll get started. Don't forget, agents that from Kentucky, only Kentucky agents, you need to type in the chat box that you're here for credit, and I will make sure that I click you off as having been here. You will have to do it before you leave at the end to get the full credits. So my name is Dr. Jackie Jacob. I am extension specialist here at the University of Kentucky. And as part of my job, I do the monthly webinars as part of the Small and Backyard Flocks Community of Practice on e-extension, which is the electronic version of the Cooperative Extension, National Cooperative Extension Service. So as I said, we do our monthly webinars. Once I've let Sally start, I will put in our website and Facebook page if you want to find out more about it. So for this month's webinar, we have Dr. Sally Noll from the University of Minnesota. With all the snow there, tired. And she's going to be talking about raising turkeys. So if you'd like to share your PowerPoint again, I'll hand it over to you shortly. While Dr. Noll is talking, I will be reviewing the chat box and the Q&A. So if you have any questions at that time, I will, if it's related to what she's talking about at the time, I'll interrupt her. You'll see my picture come back on, and I'll ask her for the clarification. If it is not a clarification question, we will hold them to the end. But if you're like me, if you don't put your question down right away, you forget it. So feel free to do that. And as I said, I'll be monitoring that. Otherwise, I will be mute with no video, and Dr. Noll will be taking over. So it's all yours, Sally. As I said, I'll be watching the questions, so you don't have to worry about that.
Okay, good. I get distracted really easily. So, well, thank you very much, Jackie, for inviting me to give this talk, and I hope it will be beneficial to everybody. And regarding the e-extension website, Jackie has just done a tremendous amount of work on that website, and I refer a lot of people with questions or just wanting more information to that website as well. And actually, based on what she has on there, I think she could have given this talk as well. So anyways, so we'll get started. Just to give you a little bit of background for myself, I just recently retired at the end of December, but Jackie asked me to do this before then, so I committed to doing that. And I have a long both research and extension history with turkey production, particularly turkey nutrition and management. And so I've really enjoyed my time working with those birds, and don't tell the chicken people this, but I think I would much rather prefer to work with turkeys than chickens. So they're very interesting. Also a challenge as well. Okay, this is, let's see, enter. And let's see. Okay, Jackie, I might need some help. I'm trying to find the
Hit
words.
the down key. Does that work?
The down key. That doesn't want to work. The page down doesn't want to work.
Click on the PowerPoint so that it may have thought you were somewhere else, and then try again.
Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks.
I do that all the time.
Okay. Okay. So just a little bit of a brief outline of what I'm going to be discussing this afternoon. So one is just to give a little bit more background to get you thinking about why you might want to raise turkeys, or issues that or questions that you might have. And then I'll get into a little bit on the rearing and feeding component, followed by just some of the more common health issues that might be observed. Hopefully you don't have these, but it might happen. And then a note for biosecurity as well, as I think everybody that's probably on the call, and Jackie and I were just talking about this just a few minutes ago about the highly pathogenic avian influenza situation that is going on almost worldwide right now, or has been as well. So we're a little bit nervous about spring coming and the fall migration and everything here at Minnesota. Okay, now it looks like the slides are advancing okay. So most of the questions I get in extension anyways for people that want to, either backyard flock owners or small flock owners, and that they typically want to raise either egg layer chickens or some kind of meat type chicken, to take and process for meat later on. I very rarely get questions about raising turkeys in backyard. And I think part of it might be is that, at least here in the United States, I don't think there's a lot of, say, more urban or suburban areas that will actually allow turkeys to be raised as backyard birds. We do have a few, though, in Minnesota. But you kind of have to ask yourself, why would I want to raise turkeys or keep turkeys? And I think there's a whole bunch of reasons, and these would actually be all very similar to keeping chickens as well. We've got the exhibition type, the people that like the different varieties and strains and feather colors and so forth for the different types of turkeys. And then we also have it from the standpoint of meat production. And then also just some that would like to have some birds, and they like birds and they like to watch them and so forth, and have something to take care of. So those might be some of the different reasons why you might want to raise turkeys. And as I mentioned before, there's basically there's essentially one breed of turkey, but there's all kinds of different varieties and strains, and that can be chosen from for various purposes. But the other thing, if you're going to be raising turkeys, other considerations would be what kind of facilities do you have to keep the birds? What kind of space do you have? Can you take and contain the birds? Those would be some of the things to take and consider. And then another one would be, do you have other poultry? So a lot of times people that like birds and poultry will have a variety of different birds, particularly chickens, and then maybe extending into waterfowl. And there's a certain amount of caution, I think, that you have to use, especially for raising turkeys in the presence of chickens and waterfowl. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. And then the other thing is, at least for backyard flock owners, and that what kind of an area are you in? What might that area have in terms of different rules or permitting limitations and so forth, to be familiar with that. It's not much fun to get birds and then find out that your particular area doesn't allow that number of birds or that amount of birds, or how you have the coop set up and so forth. Okay, I mentioned that there's several different varieties and strains of turkey. So the ones more associated with meat production would be the broad-breasted white and also the broad-breasted bronze birds. And these have been selected for an increased yield of breast meat, as well as an increased growth rate. And then for many people, they're a lot more interested in the heritage type birds. And you can still get a smaller white feathered bird yet that can be raised. And then there's a lot of different types of varieties as well, with different feather colors and patterns of color on the feathers and so forth. There's just a few examples here with the bourbon red, which I understand actually originated in Kentucky. And
in Bourbon County.
In Bourbon County, I guess I should have remembered that. So we have the bronze here and the Narragansett as well. And there's if you're really into the different types of feather color in that, they're beautiful birds. Because the heritage birds, basically it means they're heritage because there hasn't been any specific selection done, for increased body weight or increased meat yield in that. There's still a lot of interest in those birds. They're a little bit slower growing and won't get as big as some of the other, like the broad-breasted white, but still suitable for some kind of meat production yet. Some of these that have the really dark feathers anyways, one of the issues, particularly if the birds are going to be processed for meat, is that there's a dark pigment that's associated with that feather, and it a lot of times tends to remain in the feather follicle that's on the skin. So on the surface of the carcass anyways, after processing, it looks like there might be, typed or a little bit of dirt or something that's still sticking to the carcass, and that's actually not the case. So it just has to do with the remaining feather pigment after processing. But anyways, it's fascinating to sit and read all about all these different varieties of turkeys. Okay, so I kind of made the assumption that there's probably several of the people that are attending that might not be as familiar with turkey production anyways. And so hopefully, so I kind of made it a lot more basic, and if you're already raising birds in that, then that's where, putting something into the chat would be helpful, so we can get into a little bit more in depth if we need to. But basically the phases of production, which are really related to the age, would be the brooding or the brood phase, and then of course the growing phase. And brooding, we oftentimes refer to as from the time of hatch up to 6 weeks of age, approximately. And it's during this time period that as caretakers, we're essentially replacing the mother hen. So we're providing the maternal care and making sure the poults stay warm and that they have access to food and stay secure as well. And with these things anyways, we're starting in a very, hopefully anyway, starting in a very clean facility with clean equipment and clean bedding and all of that. And I have to say that, turkeys, even though they look very robust, as adults, and they truly are, but as poults, they're actually very delicate. And to get them off to a good start, they need lots of tender loving care and lots of attention. and this is particularly for that first 3 to 4 days of life. They really, really need a lot of attention. So, and the success of raising them anyways is really has to do with what kind of thermal environment that's being provided, feed and water access, and then making sure that any changes that do occur over time are gradual changes. They just don't do very well with any change abruptly. Then the other major phase anyways, obviously, is growing to maturity. So sometime after 6 weeks of age. And we have all the similar goals, I think, there. We want the birds to grow well. We want them to be healthy. And to go along with that, we want to prevent any disease introductions. But one of the things to look at is that we're taking this is a turkey poult here. So poult would be a young turkey, 55 grams, basically kind of like an extra large chicken egg, I think, about that size. And then in a span of 20 to 22 weeks or so, at least on the toms anyways, they will be up to 40 pounds or even exceed that. And this would be for the broad-breasted white. And so if you think about that, that's not a lot of time. And there's a lot going on in that time period as well for that bird to take and grow. Okay, so sometimes we don't always pay as much attention to what's happening before the poults actually arrive at the farm or somebody goes and picks them up. And one of the main things here, anyways, if we talk about pre-brood setup and preparation, that we also have to consider what's going on in poult transport. So I know for some small flock here, people have to travel someplace to be able to go pick up, either the chicks or the poults and bring them back home again, or they may be transported commercially one way or another. And so any kind of chilling and overheating that occurs during that time period can cause issues with getting the birds going again, because, if they're chilled, they're going to be cold. All they want to do is kind of sit around and try to get their body heat back up again. And if they're overheating again, they're spending more energy trying to get rid of that extra heat. And so making sure that let's see, I'm going to try to get laser pointer up here. Making sure just by looking at the birds when, either during transport or after you've received them, very quickly take and assess, whether they look like they're chilled or overheated. Then even before you go pick up the birds anyways, then we need to talk about setting up for arrival. And so what kind of enclosure you're going to be using, what is going to be your source of the heat, because they have to have heat, particularly for the first several weeks of life. And then what kind of bedding material. And then a little bit about feeders and waters here, making sure you've got the appropriate feed on hand. So at least here, in the US anyways, there's feed label requirements. And anytime you go to buy a bag of feed, always make sure you're reading the label and make sure that it's appropriate for the type of poultry that you're purchasing it for. And for turkeys in particular, they have a very high crude protein content. as young birds, so 28% in comparison to like chicken broilers, where their protein requirements around 23% or so. And so feeding a chicken feed to a young turkey is not going to allow them to take and thrive. And then to give you an idea of how many birds you might be able to have in your space, and this is approximate. Typically, the allowance here would be around 0.5 to 1 square foot, assuming that the birds are going to be raised to about 5 or 6 weeks of age in that particular space. Once the the facility has been set up, it's really important to make sure that the heat is turned on before the birds arrive. And a lot of that is just to take and warm up all that space, warm up the floor, warm up the walls, warm up the bedding, because that bedding, even with the heat lamp on it, takes time to get warmed up. And anytime you're measuring temperature anyways, always measure just a few inches above the bedding, because that's where the baby birds are going to be. And then just prior to arrival, then, the waters and feeders can be added into the enclosure and scattered about. If possible, depending upon the amount of space, it's always good to try to avoid putting the feed and water right under the heat lamp, because then that heat is really just hitting that feed and could be destroying, some of the vitamins that are present. And then with the waters, while we don't want really cold water, we also don't want it to be, 100 degrees either. So we try to make sure 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So we try to make sure that these aren't right underneath the heat lamp or whatever the heat source is. Okay. So just an example of some of the things that might be used to get things set up anyways. There's you can purchase some material that's already to be set up and use that as an enclosure to keep the baby birds in for a period of time. Or you can get something that's called like poultry guard paper, and you can set up a ring with the bedding inside of that and keep the birds in there. With turkeys anyways, they do grow very quickly, and they are actually very active and jump and fly. Well, not as baby birds yet, but they jump around, and then within a couple of weeks are actually starting to at least try to fly anyways. And so try to get the material that is a little bit taller anyways, 18 inches plus if possible. And then, as I mentioned, thermometers are your best friend for getting birds started. So find out what the temperatures are in the areas that you're going to be keeping the birds, and then make sure those temperatures are adjusted to make sure they're ready to receive the birds. Heat lamps are often commonly used to provide heat, concentrated source of heat within the enclosure. And so that's one way of providing it. I prefer for bedding anyways to use pine shavings that have been dried. These typically have fewer contaminants present from the standpoint of different types of mold in that. And try to get a decent depth to it, 3 to 5 inches in depth. And then make sure when you put it down that it's nice and evenly spread. Sometimes, people might dump a bag of shavings into the enclosure and kind of try to spread it around a little bit. But when you think you've got these little poults that are 3 or 4 inches tall, and there's a big mound of wood shavings that might be blocking them from seeing the feeder or the water, just making sure it gets spread out nice and evenly as much as possible. And then, of course, for feeders and waters, there are all kinds of those out there, and a lot of people make their own as well. And I think it's just exploring to see what's there, what you want to pay, for such a thing, or make your own. But having feed and water readily available and available at all times is really important for the turkey poults. Okay, so this is just a couple of examples here. So in a large commercial facility, and actually these rings are actually kind of small for a large commercial. This was actually at a research facility, which had one barn that I guess we could call it kind of a medium-sized commercial facility anyways. But if you think about it, so we've got the room that the birds are being kept in, and then we've got the Brutogard paper, basically a corrugated paper type material that will keep the birds contained and keep them close. The whole purpose here is to keep them close to the feeders and waters. And then we have our heat source here, which is a brooder stove. And then a couple of other things, the equipment for when the birds get older are also present here too. So these would be an automatic feeding line. And likewise, the bell type waters here, an automatic watering system. But then you'll also note that there's some smaller waters in here. So we're supplementing and just trying to make sure the birds, no matter where they go, that they're seeing some feed and water. And then we also have some supplemental feeders here as well, some trough waters that are open. And again, just trying to make sure that the birds are accessing these as they walk around and explore their setting in that. Another thing you can see in this picture is that we've got a little bit of scattering, but a lot of the birds are more in the middle here, which means that the temperature might need to be a little bit more warmer to try to get a little bit of additional activity here and get them walking around and spreading out. So same thing in a small space, basically. You'll have your heat lamp source that's going to provide the concentrated heat. In this case here, we've got some, these are actually pens with plywood siding on them. And so it's a small number of birds. We would typically place about 10 or 20 turkey poults in, let's see, this would be a 6x8 pen. And same principle, this case here, we have the bottom of the feeder pan. We haven't put the feeder top on yet. So for the first few days with this type of a feeder, we'll set it down into the bedding, make sure the birds have access to it, and leave the top off, like I said, to give them a chance to take and explore. Part of the problem though here is that they will sit and defecate in here. So need to keep the space, clean it up every once in a while and mix up the feed a little bit, because sometimes when they're sitting on it, it'll take and compress the feed, make it a little bit harder for them to take and eat. We have some supplemental waters here, very common type water. And there is a automatic water over in this area here that you can't see. And then we also put out some trays, basically egg flats with some feed that's put on them, and take and spread those around the pen as well. Again, just to try to get the birds to basically stumble across the feed and water and start eating and drinking then. Okay, so as I mentioned, environmental temperature, finding that comfort zone for the bird is really important, because without it, they will just sit or they will pile in a corner or something like that and not eat. And this
There was
is what
a question. How long did you say to keep feeder open?
Well, okay, so for putting the feeder top back on, is that probably what I'll go back here. Okay. So this one, there's a feeder top that would go over the top of this. We would, at least for 2 or 3 days, and try to see how much traffic, how the feed is disappearing in that. And if we feel like they're still not hitting the feed the way that they should, we might keep it that way for a couple more days, but then to get so sometime within that first week, I guess, is probably a better answer.
Okay.
On these, the supplemental feeders, we basically have feed on them, and then once the feed disappears, then these are taken out and thrown away.
Okay.
Okay, so back to temperature and the comfort zone. And these are only guidelines, because I've been in barns and that, in our research facilities and that, and even though the thermometer says the temperature is at 90 degrees, the birds could either be hot or cold depending upon what the air exchange is and drafts and so forth. So you really have to look for the bird behavior as to what's going on. But if you're not going to have a concentrated heat source like a heat lamp or a brooder stove, then you can do something that we call warm room brooding. And that's you take an enclosure or a smaller part of the barn or whatever and heat it up to 90 degrees. And that should be comfortable for the birds. But like it said, you know, sometimes if heat is being lost faster or something like that, you might have to increase or make an adjustment there. The other is to heat up both the room, so the room that they're in around 85 degrees, and then have that concentrated heat lamp set somewhere between 95 to 100, okay? And then again, pay attention to what's going on with the birds and make your adjustments. And when you do make adjustments, unless you're finding something that's really extreme, just try to make a gradual adjustment because that can be a little bit of a shock as well. So huddling, obviously when you get cold, you know, you're going to huddle and poults will do the same. But I've also seen huddling when the birds have been overheated. And most of the time this happens when they're very young, they're not set up to really figure out what their temperature is yet. So the regulation of their body temperature needs to develop for a few more days yet. So I have also seen where birds have huddled when they're overheated, but they just don't seem to know that they're overheated. And in that case, a lot of times you'll also see a lot of panting then because of that situation. Cold feet, you know, if they're chilled, their feet will feel quite cold. And then also look, like we just talked about in that brooder ring, how are the birds spaced out? Are they crowded together? Or are they at the edges of the enclosure or something? And these would all be indications, you know, that some kind of temperature adjustment needs to be made. One of the advantages of using a heat lamp anyways, or a brooder stove, is that you can have some variability within the ring what the temperature is, okay? And some birds may like it hotter and some birds may like it a little bit cooler. And that gives them a little bit of a way to take and adjust their own comfort zone. Like I said, it's good to have the bedding warmed up before the facility warmed up and that before placing. And then from the time that the birds are placed until about 6 weeks of age, you'll spend a lot of times lowering the room environmental temperature very slowly so that we're down to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit by around 6 weeks of age. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can take and raise the heat lamps so it's not quite as hot underneath the heat lamp. At the same time, you can take and decrease the room temperature. Typically at our research farm, we would remove the heat lamps around 2 to 3 weeks of age, unless it was a really cold January or something like that. And then at the same time, whatever enclosure you've been using to try to keep the birds close to the heat source, a brooder ring or some kind of barrier in that, usually typically would start to remove those around 2 to 3 weeks of age, because by that time the birds are jumping over the paper anyways. So, okay. So this is just trying to demonstrate here a temperature gradient. So the very dark spot would be, say, where the heat lamp or the brooder stove would be. And for turkeys anyways, we're looking at that 95 to 100. And then as you move away from that heat source, it's going to be a little bit cooler. So somewhere around 85 to 95. And then once you're at the outer, this would be, just think of this as being the brooder guard paper or whatever barrier it is, we would have more like an 80 to an 85 degree. So birds can kind of say, well, you know, I kind of want a little bit more heat right now, or maybe I'm I'm going to be out in this area here and still feel comfortable in that. So after a while, once their thermal regulation gets set up, you'll start to see them doing more migration in and out of the hot areas. Okay. So probably not.
Before you move on, there's a couple of clarifications. Has anyone worked with infrared type panels for heating poults?
Yes, they have. And you can also purchase that type of a system as well. I haven't heard, or I don't know, if they are have much of a different effect on the birds as saying, a traditional brooder stove type thing.
And what lamp color is favorite, yellow or red?
Which color?
The heat lamps,
oh,
red or white?
We've used both, and I don't think that we've seen much of a difference between the two. And some of it also depended upon, what we could actually purchase at any one time as well. But I don't remember anything saying, that they thought they were having more problems with the white versus the red or vice versa.
I think the only difference would be that the white would be 24-hour light. Is that what you use in the first few weeks?
Yeah, well, that's true. That's a good point. Because normally we don't want them on 24 hours of light after a period of time. So the red lamps are a little better that way. Good point.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. So a couple of other things. So we've got the birds on feed and along with that, they're starting to excrete things. And so we have the bedding there. The bedding, a lot of the bedding purpose is basically for moisture collection, but we don't want that moisture to take and build up. So we have the moisture coming from the excreta, what might be spilled from the waters, or if we're in a really high humid summer type situation, the bedding's going to gain moisture as well. And then you'll see this buildup occur particularly around the feeders and waters, because that's where a lot of the material is deposited. And so really what we want to see is, remove that buildup and those damp spots in that, particularly in this brooding period, because it doesn't take long for that to cause an issue. And the issue really comes down to foot pad dermatitis then. And that's a lesion that forms on the bottom of the foot pad. And so you can see here, we've got normal foot pads, and then we've got some foot pads that are slightly affected. And then we've got some foot pads with the foot pad dermatitis, which is severely affected. And a lot of research has gone into how litter moisture affects us, and that these changes in this foot pad can happen, within about 48 hours after birds have been exposed to wet litter and are staying on wet litter. So that's really one thing to keep up on in the barn. Feeding and watering, mentioned already about needing to make sure we have appropriate starter diet for the turkeys. And then as they grow and get older, the protein levels can be reduced. And also talked about having several feeders and waters present, particularly that first week or so that first week when the birds are still figuring out what is feed and what is water. Kind of a neat thing that you can do is once the birds have been placed and started to eat in that, you want to give them time to settle in and everything. You don't want to disturb them. But sometime after about 12 hours or so, or whatever convenient, you can actually pick up the bird and check for crop fill. So the crop is a storage organ for the birds when they eat and drink, and before it goes into the stomach. And it's very easy to take and palpate the crop right underneath well, that, anyways, crop is there. Sorry about that. I wish I had a figure now. But anyways, you can palpate and see if they have started eating and drinking in that. And if they haven't, then you may want to just check around and see what again, I would always come back to temperature anyways, as being one of the things that might be limiting them from moving around. Make sure the excreta gets cleaned out. Clean water, very important, because at these high temperatures, 80, 90, 100 degrees, the water stagnates very quickly and you'll get bacterial growth. Okay, so back to this picture again, just a couple of other things here. So we've got cleaning out the feeders and that, and you might have to do this even when the feeder top is on. Because the birds may take and defecate into that, the feeder space. A couple of other things I just wanted to mention. Here we're seeing that some cardboard paper here has been set up to keep the birds from going into the corner. For some reason, they really like the corner, and so not having any corners present in any kind of setup that you have, at least initially, just to keep them from doing that behavior. Okay, so moving on to growing, and probably not going to spend as much time here just because we'll be running out of time, but basically, hopefully by now all your birds have survived and they're growing well, and now they're going to need more space, so you're going to have to take and increase the amount of space. So depending upon the size of the birds and the age of the birds and that, somewhere around 2 to 5 square foot per bird in a confinement situation. And then different types of facilities or enclosures can be used. You can have something that is what we call totally confinement, so they're inside a barn or a room or something like that. Semi-confinement would be where that enclosure opens into a yard. And then they could also be placed out on pasture with some kind of shelters out there as well. And at least in the confinement situation, you can take and control, the environment in that. But out on pasture, there's less control. And so if you're moving, 6 or 7 week old poults out into pasture in that, it has to be a really careful transition and making sure that you're looking at what the weather's doing, and hopefully not too cold and or too rainy or snowy, here in Minnesota anyways. Feed and water, we're going to be starting to take and decrease the protein levels now a little bit more. I prefer to have a pelleted feed fed if possible, just because you get less feed wastage, but other form of feed is appropriate as well. Keeping water clean, again, still very important. A couple of comments here on equipment. So for the feeders and waters, I think I read some things where they talk about, you can just use whatever you use for chickens. And that's not quite true anyways, because here, just as a picture here, we have these pretty big turkeys here, and some of the smaller waters we would have, just wouldn't last in this type of a situation, nor would they have the capacity to take and meet the birds' needs for water, on a daily basis and that. So just to be careful that you're, buying or making the appropriate type feeders and waters and that. And then if the birds are out on pasture, obviously, if you have feeders out there that, that they're going to need to be protected against the rain if they're not part of a shelter system. So, okay. So kind of when you look at my other management here, it's probably not a whole lot different than what it was for brooding, but we're going to, in confinement anyways, we're going to continue to gradually decrease the temperature. Older turkeys are actually relatively tolerant and adaptable to colder temperatures. And if you're looking at growth rates anyways, they actually grow a little bit better when it's cooler anyways.
There was a clarification. At what point do you switch to 16% crude protein?
Finisher, probably around 16 weeks of age.
Okay, thank you.
Might be, those would be for toms. It might be a little sooner for hens, so maybe more around 12 weeks of age or so for hens, so. Okay, and again, looking at the label and what the label feeding directions are, just to make sure you're double checking that. Okay. With litter anyways, again, kind of the same stuff. You want to take and remove those crusty areas or those really damp areas, or do some kind of tilling or mixing. And then when needed, take and add new bedding. But if you're adding new bedding, it has to be added very carefully, because turkeys can startle pretty easily in that. And so, just be careful if that's being done. Air quality and confinement, particularly for ammonia, we want to make sure we don't have an ammonia buildup in a barn. So making sure there's appropriate air exchange. And then at an older age anyways, where we're really mostly concerned with the baby poults anyways, of them being chilled, it flips now that they are bigger birds and heavier birds and older birds, that they actually become more susceptible to heat stress. And so being prepared for that, particularly having birds in the summertime in confinement, making sure that there's good air movement going on. In pasture systems, even though there's no bedding involved here, it doesn't hurt to try to take and move shelters and feeders and waters around to prevent manure accumulation in that area. And because that will relate back a little bit to the foot pad dermatitis as well. Make sure that there's some kind of sufficient fencing type material or something to keep the birds within an area. Turkeys are actually fairly athletic, especially younger birds and the hens. So, I mean, they do, when they have the opportunity, they do a lot of running and jumping, flying and gliding. And even in our research facility, our panels for the pens go up about 6 feet. And from about 8 to 10 weeks of age, at least for the hens anyways, we do have issues with them essentially climbing the fencing and jumping over that divider. So pasture again, weather, predation, impact. I was listening to one talk anyways on wild turkeys here a little while ago, and they said everything wants to eat a turkey. So, we've got the coyotes, we've got the raccoons, we've got the possums. So a lot of different things will try to take those birds.
There's a couple of clarifications. Is grit required for the ones on pasture similar to chickens?
Okay, so definitely if they're on pasture, I would supplement grit. And I would also, even if they're in confinement, I would also offer grit, once or twice a week to the birds, because they might be foraging, within the barn and eating some of the litter material in that, which has a high fiber content. And also the grit just kind of seems to add a little bit to maintaining their gut health as well.
So once or twice a week, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. And then any recommendations on fencing or other ways to protect them from predation?
No, I'm sorry. I don't have any good recommendations for that. So
electric fencing tends to work.
Okay.
That's it. Other than there was one on if diarrhea occurs, what should you do?
Oh,
depends on why you got diarrhea.
Yeah, that one's a hard one because most likely, I mean, obviously it's some kind of enteritis effect going on there. And it could be a disease related issue, or it could be a feed related issue. And trying to sort those out can be hard, particularly if you can't do or can't afford some diagnostics in that. I think from the standpoint of the diarrhea, just trying to, again, make sure the birds are comfortable. If they're stressed, temperature wise or other stresses in that, Make sure that there's good clean water available too, so whatever they might have isn't recirculating back into their system again. And then really, if you can get some diagnostics, that would be helpful. Because it could be due to some parasites or other enteric diseases. Okay.
That's it.
Okay. So move on a little bit on some health issues. I'm actually going to start out with not disease per se section here on the right-hand side. So oftentimes when we get mortality that occurs during early brooding, it's called starve outs, but in reality, a lot of times it could also be dehydration. Regardless, it means that the birds didn't get to either the feed and or water. And, within a short time period, about 3 days in that, they end up getting weak and perishing. We talked already about the dermatitis, foot pad dermatitis already. Breast blisters, these would be water-filled, or they look like water-filled sacs that form over the keel. Oftentimes, this is due to hard surface contact and also poor litter conditions as well, where there's moisture. And so the combination anyways, again, irritates that skin, I think, and the bursa associated with the curl, with the keel bone, and the blisters taking form. Lameness, again, wet litter seems to precipitate some lameness, and it could be in association with the foot pad dermatitis. So bacteria or whatever are entering into the system, through that damaged foot pad. It could also be nutrition related. So sometimes there can be issues with insufficient vitamin D or calcium or phosphorus in the diet as well that can cause some lameness. Pecking, the head or other areas. Typically, if it's around the head, it can get to be quite severe, fighting among toms and that. And I meant to put this in here, but with some of these things, birds that look like they're not doing well, having some lame issues, or being pecked on by other birds and that, if you can have, I call it like a hospital area. So area to take and separate those birds and see if they have a chance to try to take and recover. Scratches and tears, these are big birds. And if they start piling on top of each other, particularly as they're getting older, tears into the skin or scratches in that affect the carcass quality as well as potentially, developing infections later on. And then turkeys, again, compared to chickens, their wings are quite large and they have a large wingspan anyways. And so being careful when you're handling them or making sure you don't have things in the area that they're in where they can take and flap their wings and take and get a broken wing anyways. And so sometimes these things happen, birds get startled, they pile, they're flapping their wings to get away from whatever is taking and scaring them. And so you'll see a lot of the scratches, tears, and potentially some broken wings as well. For disease, just talking about diarrhea, enteric diseases anyways. So we might see that all of these different situations here. Coccidiosis is a protozoan parasite, builds up particularly in areas where birds are continually being raised in that. You can obtain a medicated feed that has a drug in it called amprolium, and that can take and help control the coccidiosis in the young birds until they develop immunity. We could spend days and days talking about all the different viral and bacterial causes of enteric disease, and so that's where diagnoses really come into play. And then I mentioned about chickens and waterfowl being in the same area anyways as turkeys. And one of the reasons we don't like to do that is because there's another protozoan organism called blackhead, and it's carried via roundworm and cecal worms. And for some reason, it doesn't affect chickens as much. So chickens end up being a carrier for this particular organism. And then when it gets into the turkeys, it's very severe mortality. You can basically lose basically all the birds that you have. And there's really no known, I shouldn't say there's not any treatment available for this particular disease. In confinement, we have to be worried about inflammation in the respiratory system, particularly by ammonia and dust, although again, there's a variety of viruses and bacteria that will also cause respiratory disease. And then I had mentioned about avian influenza, respiratory disease as well in birds. There's the low path and the high path varieties. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, but waterfowl, particularly ducks, happen to be an excellent carrier for this particular disease. And so again, if you're keeping turkeys and you've also got ducks, there would be the concern then of the transfer of this organism to the turkeys. And then we have I guess you call it the garden variety of other worms, mites, and lice that also might cause problems as well. Okay. This was a little graphic that just came out from our extension service here, a little nice poster in that. But I think it's a reminder, and whether we're talking about avian influenza or other disease organisms, in that really biosecurity is the only way to take and protect your flock. And I know we kind of get into discussions, particularly if we have free roaming birds and that about having a biosecurity plan regardless. But I think there's certain things you can still do yet. But so in this case here, trying to, keep feed contained. That's one of the areas where, particularly again, if you have outside feeders, wild birds will come in and feed on that. So hopefully try to keep that inside and prevent the entry of wild birds. Clean up feed spills, sometimes handling a feed bag or getting some feed delivered in that, there's going to be some spillage. So take and make sure that gets cleaned up as well. For those people that are keeping birds, primarily for exhibition and traveling to different shows or swaps, sales, judging contests, those types of things, make sure that you're trying to prevent bringing disease back to the farm, preventing disease leaving your farm and going to the swap or whatever, and vice versa. Try not to bring anything back to your farm. So doing some precautions there. And then even with visitors, I know it's kind of fun to have somebody come over and look at your birds and that, but just, use a certain amount of precautions, when they come to take and visit in that. Okay. So a few things about turkeys, if you're not familiar with them, at least in contrast to chickens. As I mentioned, they're delicate as young birds, but once they get started and get growing, they become more tolerant. And then they also tend to be a lot more active and vocal, especially in compared to chicken broilers. And a lot of that is normal. But if they get really, really loud, or if they're running around like they just don't know what they're doing, then typically that means there's something wrong, that they have, they're probably getting some kind of gut condition and nothing satisfies them. And so they just keep moving around and calling because they're not feeling very well. And then obviously once infection sets in and gets more severe, you'll see a lot more inactivity and some vocalization, but and that the turkeys can take and startle any kind of noise, different colors, like people wearing different color coveralls or hats or garbage that might be flying around, movement in that, they still have a lot of wild traits in them. So, and let's see. Oh, the other thing, they're not generally fearful of humans, particularly their caretakers. Okay. And at least on our research farm, they, when we were in the pens or in the big barn and that, they would take and follow us around. When somebody entered the barn, they would take and greet and stand up and gobble if they were toms. But the toms also, once they get old enough and sexually mature, they can become aggressive as well. And they are very curious birds. And as I mentioned, they are very athletic. Sometimes we may not give them credit for that, but they are. And as I mentioned, the adults are very strong and their wings are large and powerful. And so, we've had them break connections on water pipes. We've had them push down barriers and break fencing and beat up the feeders, hanging feeders. So they were swinging all over the place. And so just to kind of keep in mind that they're not going to be, a very docile bird, I guess I should say. So, okay. So in summary then, raising turkeys successfully can be challenging and you need to build experience with it. And as I mentioned, early brooding conditions are extremely critical for livability. And thermometers are your best friend, and particularly, for those first few days, make sure you know what your temperatures are and what the birds are being exposed to. Before you get birds, do your research, read up about the different varieties, different setups in that. And then once you do decide to get birds, make sure everything is in place before you actually get the birds. Sometimes I think we kind of depend on other things to look at, but taking time to take and observe the behavior, I think, is very critical to flock management. And then, as I mentioned, practice biosecurity. I know everybody's probably getting tired of hearing that over and over again, but particularly in the case of turkeys, there's just so many diseases and a lot of them don't have any treatments or very limited treatments to try to combat them. So preventing disease introductions is the best way to go. Okay, so a couple resources, poultry, the e-extension website that Jackie has, and then make sure you, depending upon where you're at, you could contact your state or local extension. Try to visit with other people that are keeping turkeys and get information from them about what to do and not do. And then particularly if you have any questions about avian influenza, contact your state board of animal health or similar organization. I think some states, it's actually under the Department of Ag. So I think that's it. Okay.
Okay, there are some questions. What is the average life expectancy for heritage turkeys?
Boy, I couldn't give you a good number on that. For the selected mate bird anyways, because they do continue growing throughout their lifetime, eventually, that puts stress on their respiratory systems or cardio systems and legs and so forth. So we're probably looking, at maybe 3 to 4 years there, at least for the toms anyways. On the heritage, I would expect, a little bit longer lifetime just because, they're lighter birds, more slower growing. So
check with the Livestock Conservancy. I'll put the link in the chat. Okay. They will have all that information. They specialize in heritage birds. An anonymous attendee would like to know, how can you prevent aggression in toms?
Well, I don't know if you can prevent all aggression in toms, okay, but some of the things you can, adequate space would be one of those. Trying to make sure the birds are around all the same stage of development, because what kind of happens is that as they're getting more mature in that, some of the birds are lagging behind and some of them are ahead. And so that can kind of create some conflict there. There's been a little bit of research, I think, on trying to put different environmental enrichments, but I haven't seen anything that said it's highly successful. The other thing you can do if the birds are in confinement anyways, is you can take and decrease the light intensity and the hours of light. If you're not going to be using them for breeding, so that will take and help there a little bit.
How few do you recommend for a backyard flock?
How few?
How few? That's what it says.
Okay.
You don't want just one, right?
Right. And
depends on how many you can eat and kill.
Yeah, and how many you want to feed and all of that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's nice to maybe a half a dozen, but again, that just all depends. I mean, you will have some losses. So if you get 2 birds, you can't necessarily assume that both are going to make it to maturity. So
when we were little, my dad started raising turkeys, and they told him that turkeys were extremely hard to raise and expect high mortality. So he got 10, and they all lived.
Oh, that's good.
That was a lot of turkeys.
Well, he must have been doing everything right from the start. So yeah.
And somebody wanted to know if they get a copy of this presentation. It was recorded, is being recorded, and the recording will be made available. Can you use a small flock in a chicken tractor style on pasture? So turkeys using a chicken tractor.
I know some people have. The deal gets to be turkeys are quite a bit taller, and so whatever system you have has to take and accommodate the height of the turkey. So I'm assuming by that type of system, you mean where they're in basically a coop that gets moved every day or periodically, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's would be my.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I just think chickens are, their height is relatively small compared to a turkey. And it also depends on how long you want to keep the turkeys as well. So,
yeah, I mean, they can't, depending on what kind of turkey, it's kind of hard to have them go up a ramp into something that's mobile too.
Yeah.
Any other questions? 24 feet, inches tall. So the tractor they'd have to go up 24 inches to get into the tractor.
Gosh, I just can't picture that. I'm sorry.
I can't see big toms trying to get up that.
No, especially mature toms. No, I mean, when they're loaded out commercially, generally they have like a conveyor belt that the birds are moved on. So
yeah, I don't see them doing it.
Yeah.
Oops. They would not go out of the tractor. So it's just having something that you would be confined in and moving the confinement.
Yeah, so I think that would work. It's just whether it's the coop or whatever it is tall enough to accommodate the turkeys.
Yeah.
Because if it's a chicken one, I'm assuming they're relatively, short, and I mean short in height. So
I'm just typing it in.
Okay.
Brendan, you are not registered on the PERS page, so you might want to do that if you want me to give you credit. Anyone else who was a University of Kentucky agent and needs credit, you need to have signed in and let me know you're there. Right now, Brendan is the only one. Any other questions? We have gone a little over time. As I said, this is being recorded. Once I get the recording from the Zoom office, I will post it on our YouTube page. there will be a link from where you originally registered, or the link that took you to the Qualtrics to register, and it will be posted on our Facebook page. Next week's webinar is Ron Keene from Wisconsin, so maybe by then the snow will be gone, on the
No.
management of home incubators. Okay. Brendan, you just needed to register on KERS if you want to get it. Okay, so that's it for today. Hope people will see us. Next month's topic is daily management of a home incubator from Ron Keene from Wisconsin. KERS, you have to be an agent to get it. You should know what KERS is. If you don't, you're not an agent and I can't give you credit. So yeah, so hopefully you'll get us next month. The page that I put out before has a link to all of our past recordings, as well as our, what is it, extinction? Can't even remember the damn. You'd think I'd know it after all this time. I was typing it right. It just didn't look right. There we go. I guess that's it. That was a great job, Sally. I hope you enjoy your retirement. Try and get some time. Hopefully the snow will go away sooner than later, but I know you love winter sports too, so, or winter activities too.
Yeah, so it's not too bad, but the shoveling gets bad.
Yes. So thank you, everybody. Hope to see you next month. See you, Sally.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks, Jackie.